Hello, and welcome to the Cycle of Care podcast. I'm your host, Mona Zignago. Today, we're talking about grandstanding, a behavior you might also hear me refer to as posturing. I'll be using these two words, posturing and grandstanding, interchangeably throughout this episode because, while they have slightly different connotations, they often show up in similar ways. Here's my wondering for today. Have you ever seen someone try to dim another person's light, aggressively and deliberately positioning themselves above someone else in a way that silences, humiliates, or shuts them down? Maybe it happened during a staff meeting, maybe it was on social media, maybe it was in a professional training or a conference session, maybe it was directed at you or maybe someone else. Either way, you witnessed or experienced someone building themselves up by tearing someone else down. That's grandstanding. That's posturing. These moments are usually awkward, often uncomfortable, and sometimes even catastrophic, honestly. They knock us off balance and can affect our professional relationships, careers, and even our livelihood. And clearly, they disrupt the cycle of care. These behaviors aren't just about poor communication. They interrupt trust, collaboration, and shared growth. Today, we'll explore what this kind of performance looks like, why it happens, who has done research on grandstanding, and how we can respond by choosing to let our light shine and create space for others to shine too. We all shine brighter when we shine together. Just to recap, the cycle of care is the giving and receiving of energy that flows between us as we interact with one another. I have spent some time researching what facilitates care between us and what disrupts care. Understanding this helps me to understand human behavior while also staying true to who I am and my mission and vision of bringing more care into the world. I've determined that understanding this facilitation or disruption can be helped through looking at the 4 elements of relationships: listening, thinking, and responding. Understanding what my relationship is to the person or people I'm interacting with, how I listen, how I think, and how I respond helps me to discern what to do when things get uncomfortable or sticky. Today's episode explores what happens when things get weird when posturing is in the picture. In this episode, I want to analyze some specific instances of when I've been confronted with posturing in academic settings. I believe grandstanding really shows a disconnect from care, and it can be frustrating. When we are beset by a grandstanding performance, when the person values their own ego over learning, growth, and movement forward by the whole, well, this decimates care, authentic engagement, learning, and our shared growth and experiences in both academic and professional settings. Today, we'll unpack how this behavior is incredibly disruptive to trust, collaboration, and the collective good, and the flow of care. And so today, we're diving into a type of behavior that many of us have seen, felt, or unfortunately, maybe even engaged in without meaning to: performative posturing in settings where learning, collaboration, teamwork, and support should be the goal. Years ago, my dad was in Canada on a camping trip. He was out in the deep wilderness, away from all civilization. On this trip, he saw tons of beautiful scenery and wildlife. And on one of the days, as my dad sat near a river fishing, he saw a bear just down the river, about 200 yards away from him. A huge, grizzly bear. My dad sat there and watched the bear as she foraged for food in the river. He tried not to make any sudden movement so as not to disturb the bear or draw attention to himself. But the bear saw him and knew he was there. My dad continued to watch the bear for any signs of aggression or posturing. At first, the bear was standing on his hind legs. My dad knew this does not always indicate aggression. It's often curiosity, allowing the bear to see and smell better. But my dad also knew that this, paired with other behaviors, can be a warning. Other signs of posturing could be jaw popping or clacking, as loud popping sounds from bears snapping their jaws indicate stress or agitation. Bears also huff or snort. These are audible warnings meant to scare off intruders. Bears might also bluff. The bear may run a few steps or even all the way towards you, but then veer off at the last second in an attempt to make you back down. That would definitely work for me. At first, things seemed okay. The bear stood on her hind legs to see and smell my dad, but then things went downhill, and the bear began to show signs of posturing, such as snorting and bluffing, so my dad wisely backed away and headed to safer territory. People posture too. Often we also call this grandstanding. When we aren't in the world of bears, but rather engaging with humans, posturing looks like positioning oneself in a position of power and control, using things like aggressive statements or questions that are designed more to signal intelligence or status than to meaningfully engage with the topic or others in the room. Posturing is really just a type of performance folks will put on in order to assert dominance or expertise. It can show up in academia or any workplace, staff meeting, social media post, or leadership gathering. Often, grandstanding looks like combative questioning, off-topic critiques, or criticisms, or displays of superiority that derail instead of deepening the conversation we're having and the work we're engaging in. Posturing can also be more subtle, such as an overuse of high-level jargon that's designed more to impress than to support learning and growing together. Posturing also is seen when interrupting others mid-sentence, dismissing someone's ideas with a condescending tone, or dominating space to prove one's value rather than contributing meaningfully. At its core, posturing distracts from the real work, creates a toxic environment, hinders genuine learning, and undermines trust and respect. It's about being seen a certain way, shutting others down, and diminishing people. It's not about engaging with others in collaborative and generative ways. Years ago, when I was a doctoral student, I had my first taste of someone posturing in one of my presentations. I was presenting at a conference alongside a few women from my cohort. During our session, a woman in the audience interrupted us, repeatedly, to grandstand while challenging the validity of a model we were using. We had done our homework. We'd researched the model thoroughly and we could speak to its foundations, but she continued to press, criticize, posture, and undermine us. As her attacks continued, it began to feel less and less like genuine curiosity, honestly, and more like an attempt to assert control or superiority. Later, it came to light that she had just written a chapter for a book on a similar topic, but she hadn't been familiar with the model we presented. As I look back on this situation in hindsight, unfortunately, her behavior wasn't about improving the discussion, it was about protecting her own image. That moment showed me what posturing can sometimes look like. Not engagement, not generative feedback, but defensiveness, dressed up as intellectual critique. That moment also showed me how threatened some people feel when others shine. But we don't need to compete for light. There's enough for everyone. When we let others shine, we shine brighter too. Of course, this said, I ruminated unhealthily about this academic altercation for a long time afterward, and it was hard for me to move on from this situation. What really helped me and continues to help me move forward, though, is to understand situations such as these that activate me in ways that are not generative toward my work or toward bringing more care into the world. When I understand the behavior for what it is, I can continue to shine as I connect and learn with others, making space for others to shine too. Recently, I was again faced with another grandstanding session. So, as you might imagine, afterward, I did some research about posturing. I wondered, where does grandstanding come from? Why does it happen? And how can I be aware of it so that I don't do this to someone? Here's what I found. You're not going to always hear the word posturing in academic literature, but there's some work on grandstanding that helps us understand the behavior, especially how it shows up in competitive or hierarchical environments. I found 4 scholars whose insights can offer a deeper look at some factors that influence posturing. The first is Pierre Bourdieu. Pierre Bourdieu introduced the idea of symbolic capital, basically the social power someone holds because of their credentials, the language they use, or affiliations they have. In a professional or academic setting, this often plays out when someone uses advanced degrees, specialized vocabulary, or institutional status to assert themselves in a conversation. It's not always about building understanding. It's actually about showing up as a powerful person. It's about securing a higher position in the conversation. Now, symbolic capital only exists when or because other people recognize it. Pierre Bourdieu's concept of symbolic capital refers to the prestige, honor, or recognition that individuals or institutions acquire when their authority is acknowledged by others. It's a form of power derived from perception and the value others assign to a person's reputation, rather than from economic or cultural resources alone. Posturing fits right into Bourdieu's idea of symbolic capital. It's a strategic move people make to gain or maintain status in a given space. In social media, professional, or academic environments, this can look like using complex jargon, name-dropping institutions or theorists, or confidently dominating a discussion while taking down the people all around them. These behaviors often align with the unspoken rules of the field, rules that determine what counts as smart, credible, or influential. A central idea in Bourdieu's theory is that these behaviors aren't random or purely personal. They're learned. People observe what they think earns respect or attention in a particular space, and they adjust accordingly, whether it's using polished academic language, asking assertive or confrontational questions, or protecting themselves or projecting a sense of advanced knowledge of a topic. These actions are shaped by perceptions of what the posturer thinks will be taken seriously. Over time, individuals begin to perform these traits, not necessarily to foster real learning and growth together, but rather to fit into what they think are the unspoken norms of the space that they are in. Posturing in this sense becomes a kind of social armor, a way to be seen, heard, or taken seriously in systems that they believe often reward appearance over collaborative learning and performance over respectful dialogue. And I think it's important to pause on these words, respectful dialogue. We can have conversations where we ask clarifying questions or present another perspective without hostility, negativity, or aggression. But it takes each one of us living this behavior to shift the symbolic capital. We have to commit to this and shut down uncaring behaviors, lifting up warm, positive, productive conversations and interactions instead. Because when we don't fight or stop fighting for symbolic capital and instead honor each other's light, we shift the culture. It becomes a place where everyone can shine without competition, without fear. And for me, and this may sound overly simplified, but for me, this means I strive to live in a way that brings care into the world every day in every interaction. And when I feel I'm in a situation where that is not the case, I try to analyze where the disruption is. What is actually happening here? How can I gain an understanding that is generative and forward-moving? Which part or parts of the cycle of care are being disrupted? Relationships, listening, thinking, or responding? Understanding what and where helps me learn and grow and move forward. The second person, who has conducted some interesting research in a related area, is Sarah Ahmed. Sarah Ahmed's work helps us understand how institutions maintain power and how critique can become performative, not in service of truth or growth, but rather for control. In many academic and professional spaces, questions or comments are often framed as intellectual curiosity or rigor. But underneath that, they function more like gatekeeping. Who gets to speak, who gets challenged, and who gets to belong. Ahmed writes about how women and newer or more junior members of a field are often disproportionately targeted by this kind of questioning. She describes situations where someone critiques not to learn, but to prove their own authority or to discredit someone else's legitimacy. It's often wrapped in the language of just asking or pushing the conversation, but its effort is to destabilize, to undermine, and to reassert hierarchy. Posturing fits really nicely into Ahmed's idea of performative critique. It's not just about questioning, it's about gatekeeping and policing. It's a way of keeping people in their place and protecting the boundaries of what is considered legitimate knowledge or respectable behavior, and these behaviors are rarely random. Just like with symbolic capital, people learn how to posture by watching who gets rewarded and who gets sidelined in these spaces. You make yourself small so others can make themselves bigger. What makes Ahmed's work so important is that she doesn't just stop at analysis. She also helps us understand what is lost by grandstanding. When posturing goes unchecked, it erodes trust, it discourages participation, and it forces people to use their energy not to create or collaborate, but to brace for attack. It drains spaces of the very curiosity they claim to value. I find Sarah's work incredibly interesting, so here's the invitation. Are we able to notice when critique becomes performance? Can we pay attention to who's being questioned and why? Are we able to use our voices to interrupt posturing when we see it, not with aggression, but with care? Like actually interrupt posturing. Can we do that? Like Ahmed reminds us, institutional change begins in the small moments, when we choose to value people over performance and we value curiosity over control. The third researcher is Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks was a scholar, educator, and activist who challenges us to rethink how we teach, lead, and engage with each other. She wrote extensively about how traditional spaces, especially academic ones, often reward domination over dialogue. In many classrooms, boardrooms, or conference settings, the person who speaks the loudest, critiques the sharpest, or asserts the most control is often seen as the most intelligent or authoritative. But Hooks asks us to consider, what are we losing in that model? Hooks believed that true learning and transformation require care, humility, and mutual respect. In her book, Teaching to Transgress, she talks about how education can either be a practice of freedom or a practice of domination. That domination doesn't always look like yelling or overt aggression. Sometimes it looks like grandstanding, speaking in ways meant to silence others, to prove superiority, or to shut down perspectives or conversations that don't align with one's own. Posturing fits directly into the dynamic Hooks warned us about. When someone enters a space with a goal of asserting dominance, rather than building shared understanding, they're not practicing dialogue. They're reinforcing a hierarchy that says, I'm the one that gets to define what matters here. And just like Bordeaux and Ahmed, Hooks reminds us that this behavior is learned. People adapt to the systems they're in. If they see that status and recognition come from being critical, forceful, or detached, there's a chance they're going to perform those traits. But she offers another way forward. She invites us to build communities, whether in schools or workplaces, where vulnerability is welcomed, where people listen deeply, and where disagreement doesn't require disrespect. So, let's take a cue from Bell Hooks. Let's be intentional about creating spaces where we don't have to perform to be heard, where care is not a weakness but a strength, and where dialogue, real, respectful, generative dialogue is the highest form of engagement. That's how we move from posturing to presence, from power over to power with. The fourth researcher is Patricia Hill Collins. Collins is a sociologist and scholar who introduced the idea of epistemic exclusion, a term that helps us understand how certain kinds of knowledge are valued while others are routinely dismissed or ignored. In both academic and professional spaces, epistemic exclusion happens when we privilege certain voices, methods, or ways of speaking as more credible or more intelligent than others. For example, research that's quantitative or numerically based is often seen as more legitimate than qualitative storytelling. A confident, detached presentation style might be rewarded, while someone who speaks with emotion or community-based wisdom is sidelined. This dynamic doesn't just shape who gets published, it shapes who gets heard in meetings, who gets credit on projects, and who feels safe to contribute at all. Posturing plays a big role in this system. When people sense that only certain forms of communication or expression are valued or taken seriously, they may feel pressure to perform these norms, even when they don't feel natural or authentic. That can mean using unnecessarily complex language, mimicking the tone of dominant voices, or staying silent unless they're sure they're saying it right. And on the flip side, some people posture to enforce those norms, dismissing or questioning others in ways that reinforce narrow standards of what counts. Collins' work pushes us to challenge those standards. She asks us to widen our lens and consider that knowledge can come from lived experience, community practices, emotional intelligence, and cultural wisdom, not just traditional academic sources. And when we do that, we create spaces where people no longer feel the need to posture just to be taken seriously. So if we want to reduce posturing in our communities, one way is to start by expanding what and who we see as legitimate. We can interrupt epistemic exclusion by intentionally validating multiple ways of knowing. That means listening differently, asking better questions, and making room for voices that aren't always centered. As Patricia Hill Collins reminds us, the most meaningful and fair conversations often happen when we include voices that haven't always been centered. When we listen to people who've been pushed to the margins, those whose experiences don't always fit the dominant narrative. We don't just hear something different, we hear something deeper. That kind of knowledge challenges us, grows us, and helps create spaces that are more just, more human, and more whole. And in those spaces, those more human, more whole spaces, people don't have to posture to be seen. They can simply show up and shine. So why? Why do people grandstand? Their insecurity is masked as confidence. There are cultural norms that reward sharp, unkind, shaming discourse, unfortunately. The posturer has a desire to recenter the spotlight on them. And the impact of this is silences emerging voices, breaks psychological safety, shifts focus from collaboration to control, disrupts care in professional communities. In the cycle of care that flows between all of us as we interact, there are 4 elements to take note of: relationships, listening, thinking, and responding. When we are in a situation where someone is coming at us with grandstanding, The first thing we often do is to respond, when instead, it honestly may be more appropriate to listen, ask clarifying questions, and try to understand what is really happening. I want to share a story that really tested my ability to stay grounded in this theme, because it's not always easy to let your light shine when others seem determined to dim it. As I mentioned earlier, I have another more recent grandstanding experience to share. Recently, I presented at a conference where every session 2 specific researchers attended was a grandstanding performance worthy of an Oscar for them. Whether they were aware of it or not, they walked into sessions seemingly not to learn and not to help others learn, but to perform and position themselves on top. Elbowing their way verbally into every post-presentation Q&A like a grade school bully, their questions didn't clarify. They confused, challenged, and distracted. Honestly, these 2 were the talk of the town at the conference, and not in a good way. As I attended various business meetings and social gatherings at this conference, this couple became a frequent topic of conversation. Fellow attendees connected over shared experiences of the verbal sparring matches that erupted during Q&A sessions, particularly when the presenters weren't in rooms where their students were presenting. As I entered the room to set up for my presentation, I noticed the couple walk in shortly after. Ooh, it was my turn to be the target of the grandstanding performance, and I was ready, I think. After furiously taking notes during my session, right on cue, one of them asked a long-winded question that eventually turned into a conversation directed at another presenter who had presented just before I did. Thus, the strand of the question wasn't clear to me, nor was how I was going to respond. I tried to tackle one part of their question only to be interrupted almost immediately. This connects to Sarah Ahmed's research we talked about earlier. They were gatekeeping who got to speak and when, and who gets challenged, and who gets to belong. I also notice a connection to Pierre Bourdieu's work on social capital as well here, in which discourse isn't always about building understanding, it's about showing up as a powerful person and securing a higher standing in the room. But Bourdieu also said that symbolic capital only exists when others recognize it, and I think by the time I presented, the conference attendees had their fill of this couple and their grandstanding. And this is why. Because something shifted. A man in the audience spoke up. He said, "My presentation was wonderful," and called out the irrelevance of the question. He said, "I don't see how your question is at all relevant to this presenter," and he motioned towards me. He mentioned how excellent the other presentations were prior to mine as well. The woman tried to argue with him, but he wasn't having it. The couple no longer carried any symbolic capital. I feel like bell hooks would have been proud in that moment. The loudest voices did not win that day. What happened next was that the chairperson quickly wrapped things up and later told her stunned doctoral students that were in the room, "That's what posturing looks like." I've spent a lot of time reflecting on the grandstanding I witnessed at that conference and other conferences that I've attended and the way it shuts people down. I kept coming back to one question. Why? Why did this couple feel the need to posture in every room they entered? Why couldn't they simply allow others to shine in this beautiful, thoughtful space that was created for shared learning? I wondered, why wasn't their own light enough for them? Why do people feel the need to snuff out others' light just to make theirs appear brighter? Here's what I came to. Our light doesn't diminish when it's shared. It expands. And I want to be a person who lives this. And I want to live in a world where we all do as well. I want us all to share our own light and facilitate the creation of space for everyone's light to shine. We all shine brighter when we shine together. Let's pause for a moment to reflect. Posturing can be hard to see in others or ourselves. So first, step 1, think of a moment when someone postured or was grandstanding, maybe in a meeting, a workshop, classroom, on social media, or even a casual conversation. What did it feel like? What happened in your body? Step 2. Now think of a moment when you may have postured. Were you trying to appear more confident, smarter, in control? What were you protecting? Step 3. What can you do to shift from posturing to shining brighter together? Here are some ideas. Ask questions that clarify. We're not here to corner, shame, or diminish others. Acknowledge someone's work before critiquing. Stay grounded in care, not control. Be curious. Ask, what can I do to bring care into this moment? These 3 steps in this reflection are not about shame. They're about curiosity, reflection, and growing toward a culture of care in all our shared spaces. Posturing and grandstanding performances don't facilitate caring spaces centered on growth and forward movement. So let's take a moment to review this activity. The first step is recalling. Recall a moment when you were in a space when someone was posturing. Step 2, reflect. Think of a moment when you may have been the person that postured. Step 3, commit. What can you do to shift from posturing to shining brighter together? What can you do to commit to stopping others from posturing in your space? All right, it's time for the last part of our podcast for today. And this is our Cycle of Care hero for today's episode. My Cycle of Care hero for this episode is the chairperson of my session. In a conference space where posturing had been making the rounds like an unwelcome guest, the chairperson stood as a quiet force of integrity. She wasn't loud. She didn't grandstand. She led with presence, clarity, and care. During the Q&A portion of my session, when the disruptive posturing occurred, the chairperson didn't let it slide. With calm authority, she wrapped up the session and later turned that moment into a teachable one for all her doctoral students that were there. She said, that's what posturing looks like. But more importantly, her action said, here's what leadership looks like. She didn't ignore it to her students or smooth it over for the sake of keeping the peace. She named it, she modeled what it means to let your light shine, and to make room for others to shine too. This chairperson reminded me that care isn't passive. Care is forward-moving and solution-oriented. Care protects learning spaces, and care protects the people in them so that learning can thrive. The chairperson's decision to address the behavior by ending the session rather than allowing it to continue was an act of respect. She safeguarded the dignity of the presenter. She acknowledged the discomfort in the room. She affirmed the audience's right to meaningful dialogue. And she helped recenter the purpose of the gathering, not to perform superiority, but to engage in shared growth. When I think about what it means to participate in the cycle of care, I think of people like my session chair. People who use their positions not to dominate, but to lift others up. People who recognize when a moment threatens the psychological safety of a group and who act swiftly and graciously to restore it. People who understand that in academic and professional spaces alike, letting your light shine is not about dimming others, it's about illuminating the whole room. So thank you. Thank you for your care, your clarity, and your quiet leadership. As the chairperson of my session, you reminded me that even in high-stakes spaces, it is possible to respond with both courage and kindness. And in doing so, you didn't just model what you do, you made it easier for the rest of us to do the same. In closing, we all shine brighter when we shine together. I really want to create cultures in schools, on social media, in boardrooms, in meetings where care is a strength and curiosity is a norm. Grandstanding dims our light and should have no place in spaces that encourage growth and learning. I want our world to be a place where posturing has no home. This starts with each one of us disrupting grandstanding in its tracks when we see it. This starts with every single one of us having the courage to stop posturing in its tracks when we see it. Be brave, be bold, be courageous. Let your light shine and let others shine too. We are all brighter when we shine together. Thank you for joining me today. If this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who needs this message. Share it right now. You can connect with me on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, or at my website, monazignego.com. And you can learn even more about care, reflection, and transformative teaching in my book, Transforming Teaching Through the Cycle of Care. Thanks again for listening. I'm Mona Zignego, and this is the Cycle of Care podcast. Until next time, keep asking, how can I bring care into this moment? You've got this. Take care of yourselves and each other. Take care.